May 22nd, 2010. A Saturday afternoon in Orange County, California. The kind of day when families gather, when sons visit their fathers, when life feels predictable and safe. But for Stephen Hare, this Saturday felt different. His 26-year-old son, Sam, hadn't answered his phone in over 24 hours. No returned calls, no text messages, nothing. For most parents, this might seem normal. Young adults living their own lives, caught up in weekend plans. But Stephen knew his son. Sam was reliable. Sam always called back. The worried father stood outside his son's apartment complex, keys trembling slightly in his hand. He had a spare key for emergencies, and this felt like one. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and somewhere in the distance, children were playing. Normal sounds of a normal Saturday. Stephen pressed the doorbell. Once, twice. The familiar chime echoed inside, but no footsteps followed. He knocked, calling out his son's name. Sam? Sam, it's Dad. His voice carried that particular tone every parent knows, the one that tries to stay calm while fear creeps in around the edges. Silence. Taking a deep breath, Stephen slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a soft click, and he stepped into his son's world. Everything looked normal at first glance. The living room was tidy, just like Sam always kept it. Military training had taught him discipline, and it showed in every corner of his home. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. It carried that heavy weight that settles in spaces where something terrible has happened. Sam? Stephen called again, moving deeper into the apartment. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. The kitchen was clean, the bathroom empty. Each room he checked added another layer to his growing dread. Then he reached the bedroom door. Stephen Hare had lived through many difficult moments in his 52 years. He'd buried his own father, weathered a divorce, worried through his son's deployment to Afghanistan. But nothing had prepared him for what waited behind that door. The room looked like a crime scene from a nightmare. Blood. So much blood. And there, on the bed where his son should have been sleeping safely, lay a young woman Stephen recognized as Julie, one of Sam's friends from college. But it was the details that would haunt him forever. Someone had placed a birthday party crown on her head, the kind children wear at celebrations, bright and colorful and innocent. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. This should have been a place of life, of youth, of dreams. Instead, it had become a chamber of horror. Julie had been shot. The wounds were devastating, and whoever had done this hadn't stopped there. Her clothes were torn, destroyed. Words, ugly, hateful words, were scrawled across her shirt in what looked like marker. This wasn't just murder. This was rage. This was someone trying to send a message. Stephen's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrible than the last. Where was Sam? Was he hurt? Was he... Stephen couldn't finish that thought, but there was another possibility creeping into his consciousness, one that made him feel sick. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen, and Sam was nowhere to be found. As a father, Stephen wanted to believe his son was innocent. Had to believe it. Sam had struggled after his return from Afghanistan, yes. The war had left its mark, and PTSD was a daily battle. But Sam was getting help. He was building a new life, planning for the future, saving money for his dreams of becoming an officer. This couldn't be Sam's doing. It simply couldn't be. But if not Sam, then who? And where was his son? Stephen's hands shook as he dialed 911. The operator's voice seemed to come from very far away as he tried to explain what he'd found. My son's apartment. There's been a murder. A young woman. She's dead. Within minutes, the quiet apartment complex would be swarming with police cars, their red and blue lights painting the building in urgent colors. Crime scene tape would section off Sam's home. Detectives would begin asking questions that Stephen wasn't ready to answer. But in those final moments before the chaos arrived, Stephen Hare stood alone in his son's bedroom, looking at a scene that would change everything. The afternoon sun still streamed through the windows, children still played outside, and somewhere in the distance, life continued as normal. Everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same. The investigation was about to begin. And with it, a journey into deception so elaborate, so carefully crafted, that even seasoned detectives would struggle to separate truth from performance. Because sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who look like monsters. Sometimes they're the ones who know exactly how to act like heroes. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, we need to understand who Sam and Julie really were. Because in every crime story, there are real people behind the headlines. People with dreams, fears, and futures that were stolen in an instant. Sam Hare wasn't supposed to end up as a victim. At 26, he stood tall and broad-shouldered. The kind of man who commanded respect without demanding it. His friends from college knew him as the reliable one. The guy with a steady head and a quick smile. But like many young men of his generation, Sam's path to adulthood had taken him through some dark places. High school had been different. Back then, Sam had run with a rougher crowd, drawn into the orbit of local gangs in a way that terrified his parents. In 2001, when he was just a teenager, tragedy struck his circle. A friend was killed in gang violence, and Sam's world exploded into chaos. The revenge that followed was swift and brutal. 23 young men, including Sam, found themselves facing serious charges when another gang member ended up dead. For months, Sam's future hung in the balance. Prison seemed inevitable. His parents aged years in those few months, watching their son's life potentially disappear before it had really begun. But sometimes the system works the way it should. Evidence against Sam was thin, and ultimately, charges were dropped. It was a wake-up call that quite literally saved his life. The transformation was remarkable. Sam cut ties with his old crowd and focused on finishing high school. But he knew he needed more than just distance from his past. He needed purpose. So at 18, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He enlisted in the army. Military service gave Sam structure, discipline, and most importantly, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. For 3 years, he served his country with distinction, including a deployment to Afghanistan that tested him in ways no training could prepare him for. War changes people. Sam came home carrying invisible wounds that millions of veterans know all too well. PTSD became his daily companion. Nightmares, flashbacks, and a hypervigilance that made civilian life feel alien and unpredictable. Simple sounds could transport him back to combat zones. Crowded places became minefields of anxiety. But Sam was fighting back. He was getting help, seeing counselors, taking medication when he needed it. More importantly, he had found new purpose. His dream was to become an army officer, and he was working toward that goal with the same determination that had gotten him through basic training. His apartment reflected this new direction. Everything was organized, clean, purposeful. Sam was saving money for his future, studying hard in college, and slowly rebuilding relationships with family and friends. Every weekend, he'd visit his parents, bringing that same quiet reliability that had made him so many friends in college. The Sam Hare his father found missing that Saturday was a young man who had faced his demons and was winning. Julie Kibuishi was just 23, but she had already lived more life than many people twice her age. Born in California to Japanese immigrant parents, she embodied the best of two cultures. The respect and dedication of her heritage, combined with the creative freedom of her American upbringing. From childhood, Julie had been a performer. She danced like movement was her native language, expressing emotions through her body in ways that left audiences breathless. Art flowed through her veins, and by college, she had found her calling in fashion design. Her professors at UC Irvine recognized her talent immediately. Julie had that rare combination of technical skill and creative vision that separates good designers from great ones. She could see clothing not just as fabric and thread, but as expressions of personality, mood, and story. Her sketches filled notebooks, each design more innovative than the last. But it was Julie's personality that truly set her apart. She had a gift for making people feel seen and valued. In a world where college students often struggle to find genuine connections, Julie created community wherever she went. She was the friend who remembered birthdays, who showed up when you needed someone to talk to, who could make you laugh when everything felt hopeless. There was also something wonderfully unpredictable about Julie. She might show up to a study session wearing a costume she'd designed, or convince her friends to try a new adventure she'd discovered. Life around Julie was never boring, never ordinary. That Friday night, May 21st, Julie had been doing what she loved most, celebrating with friends. There had been a party, complete with silly costumes and birthday crowns. Julie, always the performer, had been wearing one of those crowns when she received what she thought was Sam's text message. The message was simple. He was having a tough day and could use some company. For Julie, this was exactly the kind of moment that defined who she was. A friend needed her, and nothing else mattered. She didn't change clothes, didn't take off the party crown. She just grabbed her purse and headed out into the night. Julie's parents had raised her to be generous with her heart, to show up for people who mattered to her. They had also raised her to be careful, to trust her instincts, to protect herself. But sometimes, generosity and caution can't coexist. Sometimes the very qualities that make someone beautiful and loving also make them vulnerable. Sam and Julie had met in one of those college classes that brings together students from different majors, different backgrounds, different worlds. He was the quiet veteran working toward his degree while managing his own internal battles. She was the creative spirit who saw art and possibility everywhere she looked. Their friendship made perfect sense to anyone who knew them. Sam appreciated Julie's lightness, her ability to find joy in simple moments. Julie respected Sam's depth, his hard-won wisdom, his gentle strength. They could talk for hours or sit in comfortable silence. They balanced each other. There had never been anything romantic between them. They were simply two young people who had found in each other the kind of friendship that makes life richer and easier to bear. Julie felt safe with Sam. Sam felt understood by Julie. Which makes what happened next so much more tragic. Because that Friday night, when Julie received what she thought was a text from her friend asking for support, she was walking into a trap. The message hadn't come from Sam at all. Sam was already gone, already beyond anyone's help. Julie died trying to help someone she cared about. She died wearing a party crown, carrying the joy of an evening with friends into what should have been a moment of comfort for someone she loved. Two young people, two lives full of potential and promise. Two futures that were stolen by someone who saw them not as human beings, but as obstacles to getting what he wanted. Their story deserves to be told with dignity and truth. Because before they became victims, they were Sam and Julie, real people who mattered to the families and friends who loved them. And somewhere in Orange County, a killer was about to discover that some crimes are too clever for their own good. While police swarmed Sam's apartment building that Saturday evening, they had no idea that the person responsible for this horror was living just one floor below. In apartment 68B, Daniel Wozniak was probably getting ready for what should have been one of the most important performances of his life. At 26, Daniel had spent years chasing a dream that seemed perpetually just out of reach. He was a musical theater actor, talented enough to land roles, but not quite talented enough to make a real living from his craft. In Orange County's competitive theater scene, Daniel was what industry people call almost good enough, almost successful, almost ready for his big break. But Daniel had learned to compensate for limited talent with unlimited ambition. What he lacked in natural ability, he made up for with determination, and, when necessary, deception. These qualities would serve him well in ways he had never imagined. That evening, Daniel was scheduled to perform in a community theater production. It was a lead role, the kind of part that could showcase his abilities and potentially open doors to bigger opportunities. He had been preparing for weeks, perfecting his character, memorizing his lines, preparing for what he hoped would be a career-defining performance. The irony would later strike investigators as particularly chilling. While Daniel was preparing to perform on stage, he had just finished the most elaborate and deadly performance of his life. Daniel shared his cramped apartment with his fiancée, Rachel Buffett, and their relationship was as complex as everything else in Daniel's world. Rachel was stunning, The kind of beautiful that turned heads and stopped conversations. She had worked as a performer at Disneyland, playing Princess Ariel, and her otherworldly beauty made her perfect for the role. But Rachel's beauty came with expectations, both her own and others. She had grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, to being admired and coveted. She wanted things, beautiful things, expensive things, perfect things. And she wanted them with the intensity of someone who had learned early that her appearance could open doors that remained closed to others. The couple had been planning their wedding for months, and Rachel's vision was nothing short of spectacular. She wanted a beachfront ceremony, designer everything, and a honeymoon that would provide Instagram-worthy memories for years to come. She wanted, in short, the kind of wedding that announces to the world that you matter, that you're special, that your love story deserves magazine coverage. There was just one problem. They couldn't afford any of it. Daniel's theater work was sporadic and poorly paid. Rachel's Disneyland job provided steady income, but nothing close to what their dreams required. They were already behind on rent by 2 months, and their landlord was growing impatient. The wedding they had planned was going to cost more than Daniel made in an entire year. But Daniel had a solution, or at least he thought he did. He had told Rachel and their friends that he worked part-time for a bail bonds company, helping to track down people who had skipped out on their court dates. It was a lie, but it was a convincing one. It explained why he sometimes had cash when his theater work wasn't paying, and it gave him an air of worldly sophistication that theater work alone couldn't provide. The truth was simpler and more desperate. Daniel was living a completely fabricated life, sustained by increasingly elaborate lies and a growing sense of desperation. Living in the same apartment complex as Sam Hare had given Daniel a front-row seat to something that tormented him daily: financial security. Sam wasn't rich, but he was stable. He had saved money from his military service, was building toward a real future, and never seemed to worry about basic things like rent or groceries. For Daniel, watching Sam's quiet prosperity was like being a starving man forced to stare through a restaurant window. Every interaction between the neighbors was tinged with Daniel's growing resentment and envy. Sam had what Daniel wanted most: the freedom that comes with financial security. Daniel knew about Sam's military service and the compensation that came with it. He knew Sam was saving money for his future officer training. He knew, because Sam had mentioned it in the casual conversations neighbors have, that Sam kept a significant amount of cash accessible for emergencies. What started as neighborly awareness had slowly twisted into something much darker. Daniel began to think of Sam not as a friend, but as a solution to his problems. The wedding was approaching fast. Bills were piling up. Rachel's expectations weren't diminishing, and Daniel's ability to meet them was approaching zero. He needed money, and he needed it quickly. But Daniel was also an actor, trained in the art of becoming other people, of making audiences believe in characters that existed only on stage. These skills, which had served him modestly in community theater, were about to be put to a much deadlier test. On that Friday evening, May 21st, while Julie was at her party and Sam was at home, Daniel was making final preparations for more than just his theatrical performance. He was planning something that would solve all his financial problems in a single decisive action. The plan he had conceived was, in his mind, brilliantly simple. Take Sam's money, eliminate the witness, and create a scenario that would point suspicion away from himself. He had even worked out how to make it look like Sam had committed a crime and fled, leaving Daniel completely in the clear. It was, Daniel believed, the perfect crime conceived by the perfect actor. What Daniel didn't understand was that real life isn't theater. In theater, everything goes according to script. The audience sees only what you want them to see, and the performance ends when the curtain falls. But in real life, there are always unexpected complications. There are always witnesses you didn't account for, evidence you didn't consider, and consequences that extend far beyond the final bow. Daniel Wozniak was about to learn the difference between performing a role and living a reality. And that lesson would cost 2 innocent people their lives. The crime scene that greeted Orange County detectives that Saturday evening was unlike anything most of them had seen before. It wasn't just the brutality, though that was shocking enough. It was the theatrical nature of it all. The sense that someone had carefully staged this horror for maximum impact. Detective Jose Morales had worked homicide for 12 years, but something about this scene immediately set off alarm bells in his experienced mind. The birthday crown on Julie's head wasn't random violence. It was a message. The torn clothing, the obscene words scrawled across her shirt, the deliberate positioning of the body. All of it screamed of someone trying very hard to tell a specific story. But what story? And more importantly, where was Sam Hare? The apartment itself provided few clues. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle in the living areas. Valuables sat untouched on counters and shelves. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random break-in. This was personal, intimate, planned. The first assumption seemed obvious. Sam had killed Julie, probably during an attempted sexual assault, and then fled. The evidence appeared to support this theory. Julie's phone, found hidden in a closet, contained the last text message she'd received. "I'm having a bad day. Can you come over?" It was sent from Sam's number at 9:47 p.m. on Friday night. But Detective Morales had learned to be suspicious of obvious answers. In his experience, when a crime scene told too clear a story, someone was usually trying to tell it. The medical examiner's preliminary findings added another disturbing element. Despite the staged appearance of sexual assault, there was no evidence that Julie had actually been raped. Her killer had gone to great lengths to make it look like a sex crime, but had stopped short of actually committing one. Why stage a rape without committing it? The question nagged at Morales as he walked through the apartment, trying to understand the killer's mindset. Sam's disappearance only deepened the mystery. His car was gone, his cell phone was off, and his credit cards weren't being used. To the investigating team, it looked like a classic case of flight after committing murder. But Sam's father, Stephen, refused to accept this explanation. "You don't know my son," Stephen told detectives repeatedly. "Sam wouldn't hurt anyone, especially not Julie." They were friends. Something else happened here. Stephen's faith in his son was touching, but detectives had heard similar denials from countless families over the years. Parents, especially, often couldn't accept that their children were capable of violence. Sam's military background and his documented struggles with PTSD only seemed to support the theory that he had snapped under pressure. But then the first crack in the obvious narrative appeared. 2 days after the murder, Sam's credit card was used at an ATM in Long Beach, about an hour's drive from the crime scene. Security cameras captured the transaction, and detectives rushed to review the footage, expecting to see Sam making a withdrawal before continuing his flight from justice. Instead, they saw a young man they didn't recognize. He was wearing a baseball cap, pulled low, and glasses, but he was clearly not Sam Hare. This person was smaller, younger, with the slight build of a teenager, rather than the broad shoulders of a military veteran. The same card was used again 30 minutes later at a nearby pizza restaurant. More security footage. Same unknown person. Detectives canvassed the area and found the pizza delivery address, a modest apartment complex where they expected to find Sam hiding out. Instead, they found 16-year-old Wesley Freelish, confused and frightened by the sudden appearance of armed police officers at his door. Wesley had never heard of Sam Hare or Julie Kibuishi. He had no idea why police were asking him about a murder. But he did know why he had Sam's credit card. The story Wesley told opened an entirely new avenue of investigation, one that would lead detectives much closer to home than they had ever imagined. "This guy Daniel asked me to help him out," Wesley explained. "He said he worked for a bail bonds company, and there was this client who had skipped bail. He showed me some official-looking papers and said the guy owed money, and since Daniel was too busy to deal with it himself, could I go withdraw some cash using the guy's card? He said it was totally legal, part of recovering the bail money." Wesley had been paid $50 for the errand and thought nothing more of it. To a teenager, it seemed like easy money for a simple favor. He had no reason to suspect that the friendly older man who lived in his neighborhood was anything other than what he claimed to be. But Detective Morales knew better. He knew that legitimate bail bond companies don't send teenagers to make unauthorized ATM withdrawals. He also knew that Daniel Wozniak's name had already appeared in their investigation in a different context. Back at the crime scene, Among the papers scattered around Sam's apartment, investigators had found a wedding invitation. The groom's name was Daniel Wozniak, the same Daniel who had somehow acquired Sam's credit card and convinced a teenager to use it. The same Daniel who, as it turned out, lived directly below Sam in the same apartment complex. Suddenly, the obvious narrative began to crumble. If Daniel had Sam's credit card, and Daniel lived in the building, and Daniel knew Sam well enough to be invited to his wedding, then maybe Sam wasn't the killer after all. Maybe Sam was another victim. A quick check of Daniel's background revealed disturbing inconsistencies. He claimed to work for a bail bonds company, but no such employer could be found. He was supposed to be getting married in just 2 days, but was months behind on rent and deeply in debt. His fiancée, Rachel, worked at Disneyland and was known for expensive tastes that far exceeded their combined income. Most interesting of all, Daniel was a trained actor, skilled in the art of deception and performance. The same theatrical skills that had served him on stage might have been put to deadlier use in apartment 68A. When detectives arrived at Daniel's apartment, they found him calm, cooperative, and utterly convincing in his expressions of shock and confusion about his upstairs neighbor's situation. He seemed genuinely concerned about Sam and horrified by Julie's murder. But Detective Morales had interviewed enough killers to know that the most dangerous ones are often the most charming. And Daniel Wozniak was very charming indeed. "I barely knew them," Daniel said, shaking his head sadly. "Sam seemed like a nice guy, very quiet. I think I met Julie once or twice. This is just terrible. Absolutely terrible. Do you have any idea where Sam might have gone?" It was a convincing performance, delivered by someone who had spent years learning how to make audiences believe in fictional characters. But this wasn't theater, and Detective Morales wasn't an audience member willing to suspend his disbelief. "We're going to need to ask you some more detailed questions," Morales said. "And we're going to need you to come down to the station." Daniel nodded agreeably, still playing the role of the helpful neighbor. "Of course, anything I can do to help. Poor Sam must be in so much trouble. I really hope you can find him before he hurts himself or someone else." But as Daniel gathered his jacket and keys, preparing to accompany detectives to the police station, he had no idea that his carefully constructed web of lies was already beginning to unravel. The investigation was about to shift focus from the missing Sam Hare to the very present, very charming Daniel Wozniak. And once that shift occurred, the real story, a story of greed, deception, and calculated murder, would finally begin to emerge from behind the theatrical performance that had fooled everyone. Almost everyone. The interrogation room at the Orange County Sheriff's Department had seen countless confessions, denials, and breakdowns over the years. But few suspects had ever walked into that sterile space with the confidence and composure that Daniel Wozniak displayed on the evening of May 25, 2010. Daniel sat across from Detective Morales with the relaxed posture of someone helping with an investigation, rather than someone suspected of double murder. His responses were thoughtful, measured, and delivered with just the right amount of concern for his missing neighbor. "I keep thinking about Sam," Daniel said, shaking his head. "He seems so stable lately, you know? I mean, I know he had some issues from the war, but he was dealing with them. This just doesn't seem like him." It was a masterful performance, one that might have fooled investigators if they hadn't already begun pulling at the loose threads of Daniel's carefully woven story. The first thread was Wesley Freelich's testimony about the credit card. Daniel's explanation was smooth and practiced. "Look, I do some work with a bail bonds company. Just part-time stuff when theater work is slow. Sometimes people skip bail, and we have to track them down. I thought Sam might have gotten mixed up in something like that." But when detectives pressed for details about this bail bonds company, Daniel's story began to fray. The company name changed depending on who was asking. The supervisor he mentioned couldn't be reached. The paperwork he claimed to have was nowhere to be found. More importantly, investigators had discovered that Daniel's wedding was scheduled for just 2 days away, and the financial pressure he was under was enormous. His rent was months overdue, his credit cards were maxed out, and his fiancée Rachel had expectations for their wedding that far exceeded their means. The second thread was Daniel's proximity to both victims. He lived directly below Sam, knew his routines, and would have had easy access to information about Sam's finances and habits. The wedding invitation found in Sam's apartment suggested they were friendly enough for social occasions. But it was the third thread that would ultimately unravel everything. Daniel's own words. "We found something interesting in our investigation," Detective Morales said, leaning forward slightly. "The medical examiner's report shows that Julie was shot twice in the head." Daniel nodded sympathetically. "That poor girl. What kind of monster would do something like that?" "The thing is," Morales continued, "those 2 gunshot wounds weren't visible to the first responders. They were hidden by her hair, and the angle made it look like a single wound. We only discovered it was 2 shots during the autopsy." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. That's terrible." "2 shots?" "Yes, 2 shots. Which makes us wonder how you knew about both bullets." The room fell silent. For the first time since the interview began, Daniel seemed to struggle for words. The confident, helpful neighbor was suddenly replaced by someone calculating his next move. I don't think I said anything about 2 shots, Daniel replied carefully. But he had. Earlier in the interview, when describing his shock at learning about the crime, Daniel had mentioned that Julie had been shot twice in the head. It was a detail that only the killer, the investigators, and the medical examiner should have known. Detective Morales pressed the advantage. "Daniel, we're going to need you to submit to DNA testing. If you weren't in that apartment, your DNA won't be there. Simple as that." The facade began to crack. Daniel's breathing became more rapid. His hands fidgeted with his shirt sleeves, and his carefully modulated voice took on a higher pitch. "Well, I mean, I might have been in the apartment at some point. Sam and I were neighbors, after all. We probably hung out sometime." "When was the last time you were in Sam's apartment?" Daniel's pause stretched too long. "I'm not really sure. Maybe a few days ago? Time gets fuzzy when you're rehearsing for a show." But Detective Morales could sense that Daniel was reconsidering his strategy. The helpful neighbor act wasn't working anymore, and Daniel was smart enough to know it. "Look," Daniel said, suddenly adopting a different tone entirely. "I think I need to tell you what really happened. But you have to understand, I was terrified. Sam threatened me." What followed was Daniel's first attempt at a new narrative, one designed to cast him as a victim, rather than a perpetrator. According to this version, Sam had come to his apartment late Friday night, covered in blood and clearly under the influence of drugs. Sam had confessed to killing Julie in a rage after she rejected his sexual advances. But instead of calling police, Sam had threatened Daniel and Rachel, saying he would kill them both if Daniel didn't help him escape. He was completely out of his mind, Daniel said, his voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine fear. He had this wild look in his eyes, and he kept saying he had nothing left to lose. "I was terrified for Rachel's safety." In Daniel's telling, he had helped Sam flee out of fear for his own life, accepting Sam's credit card as insurance that Sam wouldn't come back to hurt them. It was a story designed to explain Daniel's possession of Sam's card while maintaining his innocence in both murders. But Detective Morales had been investigating crimes long enough to recognize a performance when he saw one. And this was definitely a performance. "So you're saying Sam killed Julie, then came to you for help, and you assisted him in escaping justice?" "I was scared," Daniel repeated. "You have to understand, he's a trained soldier. He knew how to kill people. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to call 911, Morales replied. "That's what innocent people do when someone confesses murder to them." Daniel's second story was already falling apart, but he wasn't ready to abandon it yet. For the next several hours, he stuck to this version of events, embellishing details and adding emotional flourishes that might have worked on a theater stage, but fell flat in an interrogation room. The breakthrough came when investigators received Daniel's phone records and discovered calls between Daniel and Rachel that told a very different story than the one he was spinning. In one recorded conversation, Rachel could be heard confronting Daniel. You killed them, didn't you? You killed Sam and that girl. Daniel's response was captured clearly. I'm sorry, baby. It was an accident. I never meant for things to go this far. But we needed the money, and Sam had so much just sitting there. When confronted with this recording, Daniel's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed completely. Fine, he said, slumping back in his chair. You want the truth? I'll give you the truth. But it wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was just supposed to be Sam. The confession that followed revealed a crime far more calculated and cold-blooded than investigators had imagined. Daniel hadn't snapped in a moment of desperation. He had planned this carefully, methodically, with the same attention to detail he brought to his theatrical performances. The plan had been simple in its basic concept: kill Sam, take his money, and make it look like Sam had fled after committing some other crime. Daniel had even worked out how to establish an alibi. He would commit the murder, hide the evidence, and then perform in his scheduled theater production, surrounded by witnesses who could testify to his whereabouts. But the plan required a patsy, someone whose death could be blamed on Sam to motivate his supposed flight from justice. Julie Kibwishi, with her trusting nature and friendship with Sam, had been the perfect victim for this secondary crime. I used Sam's phone to text her, Daniel admitted. I knew she'd come if she thought Sam needed help. She was always doing things like that for people. The coldness of this admission chilled everyone in the room. Daniel had exploited Julie's kindness, her generosity, her willingness to help a friend in need. He had turned her best qualities into the weapons of her own destruction. What happened when she arrived? Detective Morales asked. Daniel's response was delivered with the detached tone of someone describing a technical process rather than the murder of an innocent young woman. I told her I was worried about Sam too, that he'd called me as well. I said I thought I heard something strange from his bedroom and asked her to check with me. When she bent down to look under the bed. Daniel paused, then finished flatly. I shot her. 2 shots to the head, execution style. Then Daniel had staged the scene to look like a sexual assault, adding the degrading words to Julie's clothing and positioning her body to tell the story he wanted police to find. The crown? Morales asked. She was wearing it when she arrived. I thought it made the whole thing look more pathetic. More like something a deranged killer would do. It was a detail that revealed the depth of Daniel's callousness. Even in death, he had used Julie's joy against her, turning a symbol of celebration into part of his grotesque tableau. The confession continued for hours as Daniel laid out every aspect of his plan. The disposal of Sam's body parts in different locations. The creation of false evidence suggesting Sam's flight. The careful timing that allowed him to perform in his play just hours after committing double murder. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Daniel's confession was his attitude. There was no remorse, no shame, no recognition that he had destroyed multiple lives for money. Instead, there was an odd sort of pride in the complexity of his scheme. It almost worked, he said at one point. If that kid hadn't used the card where there were cameras, you never would have figured it out. Detective Morales looked at this young man who had murdered 2 innocent people and felt a familiar mixture of revulsion and professional satisfaction. The case was solved, the killer was confessing, and justice would be served. But nothing could bring back Sam Hare or Julie Kibwishi. Nothing could restore their families' shattered lives or fulfill the promises that had been stolen along with their futures. Daniel Wozniak had wanted to be a star, and now he would be. Just not in the way he had ever imagined. With Daniel's admission that he had killed both Sam and Julie, the horrific scope of his crimes began to emerge. But Detective Morales needed more than a basic confession. He needed to understand exactly how these murders had been carried out. And more importantly, where Sam Hare's body could be found. Daniel seemed almost relieved to finally tell the complete truth. After days of maintaining elaborate lies, the burden of deception appeared to be wearing on him. But what struck investigators most was his clinical detachment as he described the methodical planning that had gone into these killings. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, Daniel said, settling into his chair as if preparing to tell a long story. The wedding was coming up. Rachel had all these expectations, and I was drowning in debt. Every time I saw Sam, I kept thinking about how easy his life seemed. Military money, savings, no real responsibilities. The resentment in Daniel's voice was palpable. To him, Sam hadn't been a friend or even a human being with his own struggles and dreams. Sam had been a solution to a financial problem, nothing more. Daniel described how he had lured Sam to the Hungry Hunter Theater in Costa Mesa, where Daniel often performed. He had told Sam he needed help moving some equipment to the theater's attic storage area, a request that seemed reasonable coming from a neighbor. Sam was always willing to help people, Daniel said matter-of-factly. That made it easy. The theater's attic was the perfect location for what Daniel had planned. It was isolated, soundproof, and familiar territory for Daniel. Most importantly, it was a place where he could control every aspect of what was about to happen. When Sam bent down to pick up some boxes, I shot him in the back of the head, Daniel continued, his tone remaining disturbingly conversational. He died instantly. He never knew what hit him. But killing Sam was only the beginning of Daniel's plan. He knew that a missing person investigation would eventually focus on him as a neighbor and acquaintance. He needed Sam's disappearance to look like flight, not murder. With a coldness that shocked even experienced investigators, Daniel described how he had used a saw to dismember Sam's body. He removed the head and hands, the parts that would make identification possible, and packaged them separately. I buried the head and hands in El Dorado Park, Daniel said. The rest of the body, I left in the theater attic for a while. I figured I'd move it later when things cooled down. Detective Morales struggled to maintain his professional composure as Daniel described these actions with the casual tone someone might use to discuss weekend chores. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had snapped under pressure or committed a crime of passion. This was the methodical work of someone who had planned every detail in advance. But Daniel's plan had required more than just Sam's death. He needed to create a compelling reason for Sam's supposed flight, something that would focus police attention away from the apartment building where Daniel lived. That's where Julie came in, Daniel explained. I knew Sam and Julie were friends. I knew she was the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone. I used Sam's phone to text her. The text message that had lured Julie to her death was crafted with careful consideration. Daniel had made it vague enough to sound plausible, while urgent enough to ensure Julie would respond immediately. When she showed up, she was still wearing that party crown from whatever she'd been doing earlier, Daniel said. I remember thinking it was perfect. It would make the whole scene look more disturbing, more like something a deranged killer would create. Daniel's description of Julie's murder was particularly chilling in its calculated nature. He had led her into Sam's bedroom with a story about hearing strange noises, then shot her twice in the head when she bent down to investigate. I wanted it to look like Sam had tried to rape her and killed her when she resisted, Daniel explained. That would give him a reason to run, and it would explain why he wasn't answering his phone. The staging of the crime scene had been Daniel's attempt at directing one final deadly performance. He had torn Julie's clothing, written obscene words on her shirt, and positioned her body to tell the story he wanted police to discover. I even left the crown on her head, Daniel said. I thought it would make Sam look even more unhinged. After murdering Julie, Daniel had returned to the theater to prepare for his scheduled performance that evening. The play had been 9, a musical about a film director struggling with his personal and professional life. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. Daniel had murdered 2 people, and then spent the evening portraying someone else's fictional struggles. The show went really well that night, Daniel said, and for the first time during his confession, he showed genuine emotion, pride. I got a lot of compliments on my performance. Nobody suspected anything. But Daniel's plan had contained a fatal flaw that he hadn't anticipated. In his rush to create evidence of Sam's flight, he had given Sam's credit card to Wesley Freilich, without considering that the teenager would be captured on security cameras. I thought it would be perfect, Daniel said. Someone using Sam's card would prove he was alive and on the run. I never thought about the cameras. As Daniel continued his confession, investigators began to understand the full scope of his narcissism and lack of empathy. He spoke about Sam and Julie not as human beings he had wronged, but as obstacles he had successfully overcome. "It really was a good plan," he said at one point. "If that kid had been more careful, you never would have connected it to me." Detective Morales had interviewed many killers over his career, but Daniel's complete absence of remorse was particularly disturbing. Most murderers, even the most hardened criminals, showed some recognition that they had done something wrong. Daniel seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that he should feel guilty. "I needed the money," he said, as if this simple fact explained everything. Sam had money sitting in his bank account that he wasn't even using. "Rachel and I had plans, dreams. Why should we suffer when Sam was just hoarding cash?" The entitlement in Daniel's voice was staggering. He had convinced himself that his financial problems justified taking not just Sam's money, but Sam's life, and Julie's life, as collateral damage. With Daniel's confession complete, investigators finally had the information they needed to locate Sam's remains. The search of El Dorado Park would recover the buried head and hands, while the theater attic would yield the rest of Sam's body. But even as the physical evidence was being gathered, Daniel continued to speak with investigators, apparently enjoying the opportunity to explain his cleverness to an audience that was required to listen. It was a final performance by an actor who had spent his entire life seeking applause and recognition. He had finally achieved both, though not in the way he had ever imagined. The curtain was about to fall on Daniel Wozniak's career as both actor and killer. The trial of Daniel Wozniak began in December 2015, more than 5 years after the murders that had shocked Orange County. Those years had been filled with legal maneuvering, psychological evaluations, and failed attempts by Daniel's defense team to craft a narrative that might save his life. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented Daniel's recorded confession, the physical evidence linking him to both crime scenes, and testimony from witnesses who painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and narcissism. Daniel's defense attorneys tried multiple strategies. First, they claimed mental illness, arguing that their client suffered from depression and anxiety that had impaired his judgment. When that failed to gain traction, they switched to a plea for mercy, arguing that Daniel's cooperation with investigators and his supposed remorse should spare him from the death penalty. But the jury saw through every performance. They had heard Daniel's own words describing his crimes with casual indifference. They had seen the evidence of his elaborate planning and cold-blooded execution. Most damning of all, they had witnessed his complete lack of genuine remorse throughout the proceedings. Rachel Buffett, Daniel's former fiancée, also faced justice for her role in the aftermath. She was convicted of accessory charges for helping Daniel dispose of evidence and providing false alibis. She received a sentence of 32 months in prison. On December 17, 2016, Daniel Wozniak was sentenced to death for the murders of Sam Hare and Julie Kibuishi. But in a twist that seemed almost scripted for the dramatic life Daniel had always craved, California's changing politics intervened. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom issued a moratorium on all executions in the state, effectively commuting Daniel's death sentence to life in prison without parole. Today, Daniel Wozniak remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to maintain his innocence in interviews with reporters and true crime enthusiasts who seek him out. The families of Sam Hare and Julie Kibuishi continue to honor their loved ones' memories through scholarships and charitable work, ensuring that their legacies extend far beyond the tragedy that took their lives. Some stories fade with time, their details becoming blurred and their lessons forgotten. But the case of Daniel Wozniak serves as a permanent reminder that evil often wears a familiar face, and that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones who know exactly how to blend in. At Fated Clues, we believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, not for how they died, but for how they lived. Sam Hare was a young man, rebuilding his life with courage and determination. Julie Kibuishi was an artist, whose kindness touched everyone around her. Their stories didn't end with Daniel Wozniak's crimes. They continue in the lives of everyone who knew them, loved them, and refuses to let their memories fade into darkness. Next time, we'll examine another case where the truth refused to stay buried, no matter how carefully someone tried to hide it. Because when clues start to fade, we shine the light brighter. This has been Faded Clues. Keep searching for the truth.